The clock did not tick so much as it worried the air. Someone had placed it too close to the wall, so every second came with a faint, dry tap, wood on plaster, like a knuckle testing whether a door was truly shut. The sound repeated until it stopped meaning anything at all, until it became part of the room's breathing. A tap, a pause, a tap, a pause, the same as the drip in the sink, the same as the small, patient hiss of the kettle that had been taken off the flame too early and refused to admit it. A chair creaked, not from movement but from settling, as if it had finally accepted the weight it had been holding for hours. A pencil rolled half an inch across a table and came to rest against the edge of a folded paper. The paper stayed flat, held down by a mug that had gone cold. A thumb traced the rim of that mug, not because it needed tracing, but because the hand had run out of places to go. The thumb made one circle, then another, then stopped, then began again, as if it were counting in a language that required no words. Outside, a vehicle passed with the steady confidence of routine. No hurry, no panic, its engine noise rising and then fading as cleanly as if it had been rehearsed. After it went, the silence did not return fully. It came back altered, bruised by the interruption, and the room noticed. A match scratched. The first strike failed. The second one caught, flaring bright enough to sharpen the corners of everything. The shadow under a cup, the edge of a sleeve, the thin line of dust along the baseboard. The flame hovered near a cigarette but did not meet it. It was held there like an offering, like a test. Then it was blown out. The smell stayed anyway, a brief, sharp memory of heat. Someone exhaled as if finishing a long thought. Someone else didn't. There was a radio, turned low. The voice inside it sounded too close for comfort, as though the speaker stood just beyond the door and didn't want to be seen. The words were indistinct, not quite whispered, not quite clear, broken by a soft crackle that made every sentence feel unfinished. A hand reached toward the dial, adjusted it a fraction, then pulled back. The volume remained where it was, low enough to deny importance, loud enough to refuse being ignored. A page was turned, slowly, carefully, as if a faster motion might disturb something that was barely holding. The room had a way of keeping time besides the clock. Shoes were removed and put on again without anyone standing up. A coat was lifted off a hook, held in the air, then returned to the hook with gentleness that bordered on respect. A window latch was checked. Once. Then again, not because the first check had failed, but because repetition made the hands feel useful. The glass shivered faintly in its frame when the latch clicked into place, and for a moment the person at the window held still, listening, as if that click had answered a question. In the distance, too far to locate, too familiar to fear, there was a dull sound that could have been thunder or metal or something heavier settling into place. Nobody spoke about it. Nobody asked what it was. The kettle hissed. The clock tapped. The radio mumbled. The drip continued its patient rhythm into the sink like a metronome for a song no one wanted to start. A door somewhere in the building opened and closed. Footsteps crossed a hall and faded. The building creaked, adjusting to the shift of weight, and then quieted again. A hand, different from the one tracing the mug, moved across the table and flattened the folded paper as if it might try to rise. Fingers pressed down, slid along the edge, then stopped. The paper stayed folded. It was not opened. It was simply touched over and over, like an object that could turn into something else if handled long enough. On the radio, the voice paused. It wasn't the pause between sentences. It was the pause someone takes before saying what they've been avoiding. In that brief silence, the room felt suddenly too small to contain all the waiting. Even the clock seemed to hesitate, as if deciding whether to keep going. Then the voice returned. One word, then another, and the hands in the room stilled, not out of attention, but out of instinct, the way animals go still before weather breaks. No one looked at the clock, but everyone felt it, because whatever was coming had already begun moving, and there wasn't much time left. The first light of morning came in thin and undecided, diluted by cloud cover and smoke so old it no longer smelled like smoke, only like the memory of things that had burned and been replaced. It seeped through the high windows in strips, turning the dust in the air into something visible, slow, drifting particles that looked almost gentle until you watched them long enough to notice they never really settled. In the corridor outside the room, people were already walking with the practiced care of those who had learned to move quietly without being told. Boots scuffed, then corrected themselves. A door clicked shut, soft as a promise. Somewhere farther down, a typewriter began its steady mechanical chatter, short bursts followed by pauses, as if the machine itself needed to think. The building had a routine. It held onto it like a superstition. A pot of weak coffee sat on a warming plate that didn't warm much anymore. Someone poured a cup, stopped halfway, poured the rest, then stared at the dark surface as if it might reflect something useful. The smell was thin and bitter, barely present. It wasn't for comfort, it was for the hands. Something to hold, something to do while waiting. At a desk near the window, a man in a wrinkled shirt ran a finger along the edge of a map. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded too many times, the corners soft like cloth. His finger traced a line, railway or road, then stopped at a junction marked by a small, careful X. He didn't tap the spot, didn't emphasize it. He simply held his finger there, as if pressure alone could keep the world from shifting. Behind him, another man stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching without comment. He had the posture of someone who understood rank and didn't intend to forget it. His face was calm, in the way calmness can be constructed, brick by brick, until it becomes a wall. A clerk moved through the room carrying a stack of folders tied with string. The string cut into the paper like a thin line of tension. He set the stack down, adjusted the alignment with unnecessary precision, and then, after a moment's hesitation, untied the top folder and checked the first page as though confirming it still existed. He retied it immediately. Across the room, a radio sat on a cabinet, louder now than it had been in the dark hours. The voice from it was still controlled, still careful. It delivered updates like weather reports, wrapped in formal language that made danger sound manageable. Names and places were spoken with the detached clarity of someone reading from a list. Between sentences, there was always that small crackle, that brittle hesitation, as if the air itself didn't trust what was being said. No one argued with the radio. No one corrected it. The radio was not a person you could persuade. It was simply another piece of the morning, like coffee, like paper, like the thin light. A young runner appeared at the doorway and waited without stepping fully inside. He had the look of someone trying not to be noticed, which only made him more noticeable. His cap was damp around the brim, rain, sweat, or both. He held a message in his hand but didn't raise it yet, not until someone looked up. That delay, small, polite, stretched longer than it needed to. When the man at the map finally lifted his eyes, the runner crossed the room quickly, careful not to let his boots strike too loudly. He handed over the folded slip, then stood still, waiting for permission to breathe. The slip was opened, read, refolded, placed on the table as if it were nothing more than an extra sheet. No reaction, no sharp intake of breath, just a pause that felt like someone smoothing a wrinkle in fabric. "All right," the man said quietly. That was all. The runner was dismissed with a nod. He left with the same careful speed, the same deliberate quiet. The door clicked shut behind him. The room resumed its routines as if nothing had entered it. In the hallway, another door opened and voices drifted in. Low, measured, clipped. The kind of conversation that never became a conversation. It stayed a sequence of facts, numbers, short phrases exchanged like tools. "Supply will be in by midday. They said the line is holding. Reports are exaggerated." A laugh followed, brief, thin, and oddly placed. Not joy, not humor, just a reflex, a way to prove there was still a human body attached to the voice. Someone lit a cigarette and held it too close to the ashtray, letting the first ash fall almost immediately, as if impatient with the act of smoking itself. The smoke rose and flattened under the ceiling, spreading into the corners like something trying to hide. At another desk, a woman with ink-stained fingertips sorted papers into piles that looked identical. She checked dates, stamps, signatures. She moved efficiently, but every few minutes her eyes flicked toward the windows, not to look outside, but to confirm the outside was still there. Each glance was quick, almost guilty, like a private habit. Outside those windows, the yard was busy in a restrained way. Men moved crates. A truck reversed slowly, its engine sputtering, then catching again. The beeping warning sound was absent. There were no such comforts here, so the driver relied on a man behind him, guiding with hand signals. The gestures were practiced, almost elegant. Normal work, normal movement, the world continuing. And yet there were small irregularities. The kind that didn't announce themselves but left a faint grit in the mind if you paid attention. A siren sounded in the distance and cut off too soon, like someone had changed their mind halfway through. A bird landed on the wire outside and stayed there, motionless, longer than it should have, as if listening. The truck's engine coughed again, not once but twice, and the driver patted the dashboard with an odd tenderness, as though apologizing. Inside the room, a phone rang. It rang longer than usual before anyone picked it up. When it was answered, the man who lifted the receiver didn't speak first. He listened. His face remained neutral, but his jaw tightened in small increments, invisible unless you watched closely. He said, "Yes," once. Then, "Understood." Then, "We're on schedule." On schedule. That phrase moved through the room like a draft. Not because it was alarming, but because it was so confidently ordinary. It was what you said when everything was fine. It was what you said when you needed everything to be fine. The receiver was placed back in its cradle with care. No slam, no force. The man reached for his coffee, found it cold and drank anyway. His eyes returned to the map, his finger returning to the junction marked by the X, pressing down as if holding the paper in place could hold the day in place too. In a corner, a clock ticked with patient insistence. Someone wound it, even though it did not need winding. The key turned, metal on metal, a sound that felt intimate in the middle of the larger machinery of the morning. When it was done, the key was placed precisely where it always went. A door opened again. A different officer entered, coat buttoned, cap set straight, the appearance of someone stepping into an expected scene. He scanned the room, nodded to the map, to the radio, to the piles of paper. "Any changes?" he asked. "No," came the answer, too quick. The officer's eyes lingered on the folded message slip on the table, but he did not ask about it. He did not unfold it. He asked instead about breakfast, about the weather, about whether the truck had arrived. The small talk landed strangely, like a chair placed slightly off balance, but no one corrected it. No one refused it. They answered. They participated. They acted as though there was room in the day for harmless questions. The voice on the radio shifted to a different tone, still controlled but a shade tighter. A name was repeated twice, the second time with more care. A place was mentioned that made the woman sorting papers pause with her hand in midair. Her fingers held a stamp above a page, waiting for the moment to pass. It did not pass. She set the stamp down without using it. Across the room, the man at the map cleared his throat and straightened the paper again, smoothing the creases as though preparing it to be seen by someone important. He glanced at the window, then back at the table, then at the clock. His gaze moved like a pendulum. Everyone was busy. Everyone was functioning. That was the illusion the morning offered, and they accepted it because rejecting it would require a different kind of courage. Outside, the truck finally stopped moving. The guiding man lowered his hands. The engine went quiet. For a moment, there was a strange absence where the sound had been, an empty space that made everything else seem louder. The typewriter, the radio, the ticking clock, the soft shuffle of paper. In that brief quiet, the building felt as if it were listening to itself. And somewhere, buried under routine, under optimism, under the insistence of schedules and stamps and coffee cups, time began to tighten, almost imperceptibly, like a knot being pulled closed one careful inch at a time. By mid-morning, the air had changed in a way no one could quite explain. It was not louder. It was not darker. It was simply heavier, as if the building had taken on weight during the night and was now adjusting to carrying it. The corridors smelled faintly of oil and damp wool. Somewhere a radiator clicked unevenly, metal expanding and contracting without finding a stable rhythm. A report arrived by courier, sealed and stamped twice. The wax was still soft when the envelope was opened, the impression of the seal slightly blurred, as if the hand that pressed it had hesitated. The officer who broke it did so carefully, sliding a blade beneath the flap instead of tearing it open. He read the contents once, then again, then folded the paper smaller than before and slipped it into a pocket instead of placing it on the table with the others. No one asked why. At the map, a new mark had appeared. Pencil, not ink. It was faint, almost apologetic, drawn lightly enough that it could be erased with a thumb. The man who had drawn it kept his hand nearby as though tempted to rub it away, but he did not. He told himself it was provisional. Everything was provisional. That was the comfort of pencil. In the yard outside, The crates were being opened. Wood split with dry cracks that echoed briefly and then vanished. Inside the crates were parts wrapped in grease-stained cloth. A man peeled one back and frowned, turning the piece slightly to catch the light. He called another man over. They spoke quietly, heads close together, voices lost beneath the ambient noise of work. Whatever conclusion they reached, it ended with a shrug. "It'll do," one of them said. That phrase traveled easily. It was light enough to carry anywhere. Inside, the radio faltered for a moment. Not a dramatic failure, just a thin warble where the voice bent and then straightened itself again. Someone reached toward the set instinctively, then stopped. The sound corrected itself. Touching it now would only draw attention to something better left alone. A phone rang twice in quick succession and then went dead before it could be answered. The silence that followed was sharper than the ring itself. A clerk glanced at the receiver, waiting for it to ring again, but it didn't. After a few seconds, he went back to his papers, though his eyes moved faster than his hands. In a side room, a pair of officers argued softly over figures written on a chalkboard. The numbers were ordinary enough, but the spacing between them was wrong. Someone had erased and rewritten the same line 3 times, each version slightly more compressed, as if space itself were becoming scarce. "These don't match yesterday," one of them said. "They're within tolerance," the other replied, already turning away. "Barely. Barely is still within." The chalk was set down with a decisive tap. The conversation ended without resolution, not because it had been settled, but because it had been contained. There was a difference, and everyone in the room understood it. A messenger arrived carrying a bundle of forms tied too tightly. His fingers were red where the string had bitten into them. He handed the bundle over and lingered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His mouth opened as if to say something else. It closed again. "Anything else?" someone asked, not unkindly. The messenger shook his head. He left quickly, relief visible in the looseness of his shoulders once he crossed the threshold. At a desk near the window, the woman with ink-stained fingers paused her sorting. She had reached the same date twice. She checked the stamp, checked the signature, checked the date again. Everything was correct. That was the problem. It was too correct, too neatly aligned with expectations. She stacked the papers anyway, but the pause stayed with her, a faint hitch in the rhythm she couldn't smooth out. Outside, clouds moved faster than they had earlier, pushed by a wind that hadn't yet reached the ground. Flags on the far buildings hung limp, unaware of what was coming. A siren sounded again, farther away this time, and did not stop as abruptly. It faded slowly, reluctantly, as if being pulled underwater. No one commented on it. A watch was checked against the clock. The clock was checked against the radio's time signal. The radio's time signal came a few seconds late. Someone laughed quietly and said the signal must have drifted. No one corrected him by pointing out that signals did not drift. Clocks did. In a storage room, a crate was found to be missing a part. Not an essential one, according to the list, but important enough to be noticed. The list was consulted. The inventory double-checked. A note was made in the margin. The crate was resealed. "We'll flag it," someone said. The flag, like the pencil mark on the map, was small and easy to ignore. Lunch arrived and went mostly untouched. Plates cooled. Cups were refilled without being emptied. Someone stood at the window chewing mechanically, eyes unfocused, watching a group of men below argue over how to load a final piece of equipment. The argument ended with the equipment loaded the wrong way around. It was faster that way. "That'll be fine," one of them said. Inside, the phrase was repeated by someone who hadn't heard it spoken aloud. By early afternoon, the building felt crowded with unsent messages. Words that had formed and then been dismissed hung in the air like dust, invisible until the light hit them just right. A man stopped himself from making a phone call. Another rewrote a sentence 3 times and then struck it out entirely. A third folded his arms and stared at nothing, convincing himself that if something were truly wrong, it would announce itself more clearly. It didn't. The warning signs arrived quietly, wearing the disguises of minor inconveniences and acceptable deviations. They fit so neatly into the day that removing them would have required effort, explanation, and the admission that the normal day was bending. No one was ready to admit that yet. The clock kept ticking. The radio kept talking. The map stayed flat on the table, its faint pencil marks waiting patiently. And somewhere beneath all of it, The margin for error continued to shrink, unnoticed, like a door closing without a sound. By the time the afternoon light began to slant, the day had acquired a strange urgency, without anyone naming it. Shadows lengthened across desks and floors, not dramatically, just enough to make familiar rooms feel slightly misaligned, as if they had been rotated a few degrees off their usual axis. The light through the windows caught on dust and smoke residue, turning the air into something visible again, thicker now, slower. Even movement seemed to drag. Someone noticed that the radio had stopped giving routine updates and shifted instead to longer pauses between transmissions. When the voice returned, it did so with the careful neutrality of someone choosing words that would not invite questions. No one asked any. The silence between segments grew, stretching like elastic, then snapping back into sound that arrived just late enough to feel wrong. At the map table, chairs had been pulled closer without discussion. The men standing there leaned in, not out of excitement but out of habit, an unconscious gathering against something unseen. Fingers traced familiar lines again and again, stopping at the same junctions, the same intersections. The pencil mark had darkened slightly, either from being reinforced or simply from being touched too often. A decision hovered nearby without landing. In a small office off the main room, a phone receiver was lifted, held in midair and then set back down without dialing. The man who did it rubbed his forehead once, as if brushing away a thought that had come too close to the surface. He glanced at the clock, then at his watch, then out the door, as though waiting for permission to act that would arrive on its own. It didn't. A message came through the radio, shorter than expected, stripped of detail. A name was mentioned, then another. The second one caused a chair leg to scrape softly against the floor, as someone shifted their weight too suddenly. The sound was sharp enough that a few heads turned. The man straightened, nodded once, as if to apologize for the interruption, and folded his hands. "Still nothing we can't manage," someone said, not to anyone in particular. No one disagreed. Outside, the yard had grown quieter. Most of the loading was finished now. Equipment sat arranged in neat, temporary order, ready for a next step that had not yet been announced. A truck idled longer than necessary, the driver staring straight ahead, waiting for a signal that didn't come. Eventually, he shut the engine off. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the noise had been. In the corridor, boots passed and repassed, their owners carrying folders, relaying brief phrases, nodding without stopping. Information moved efficiently, but meaning lagged behind, like a shadow that no longer lined up with its source. A junior officer approached the map table and cleared his throat. He spoke carefully, as though testing each word before releasing it. "There's a discrepancy in the timing," he said. The word discrepancy hung there, fragile and exposed. "How much?" someone asked. "Minutes," he replied. "Possibly less." A pause followed. Not a dramatic one, just long enough for the idea to register, and then be quietly weighed against everything else competing for attention. "Adjust where you can," came the response. The junior officer nodded. He did not ask where. He did not ask how. He stepped back, already translating the instruction into something workable, something that would fit the existing shape of the day without forcing it to change. Across the room, the woman with ink-stained fingers noticed that her hand was trembling slightly. She clasped it with the other, pressed both palms flat against the desk, and waited for the sensation to pass. It did. She resumed her work, though her writing grew tighter, the letters more compact, as if conserving space. A file was opened that hadn't been touched all day. The contents were reviewed quickly, then just as quickly set aside. The file was placed not back where it belonged, but closer to the edge of the desk, within reach. A man at the window squinted against the light, trying to read movement in the yard below. He saw nothing alarming. That too felt wrong. The absence of visible trouble began to press on him, an unspoken question forming and dissolving before it could become solid. Someone checked the weather report. It had not changed. Clouds, wind later. Nothing immediate. Nothing that required action now. The clock chimed softly to mark the hour. The sound seemed to linger longer than usual, vibrating faintly in the ribs of the building. When it faded, no one spoke. This was the window, the narrow, quiet stretch of time where intervention still existed as a possibility rather than a memory, where a call could be made, a delay requested, a detail re-examined. The pieces were still separate enough to be rearranged. But the room was filled with people who believed that if something truly demanded interruption, it would arrive with greater force. They waited for certainty. They waited for confirmation. They waited for someone else to move first. And while they waited, the light continued to shift. The radio continued its careful pauses, and the day edged closer to a point where waiting itself would become the decision. The change was so small, it almost went unnoticed. A clerk, meaning only to clear space, slid a folder a few inches to the left. It overlapped another folder that had been placed there earlier, the one tied with string that had been loosened and retied too many times. The papers inside shifted, edges misaligning just enough that the top page no longer sat flush. Nothing fell, nothing tore, but when the clerk later reached for the folder beneath it, his fingers brushed the wrong stack first. He hesitated, frowned, then took the top folder anyway. Across the room, the radio delivered a time check, steady, official, unquestioned. Someone adjusted a watch to match it. Another man glanced at the wall clock and decided not to correct the difference he noticed. It was less than a minute. It wasn't worth mentioning. Mentioning it would require explanation, and explanation would require attention. In the yard, a final crate was sealed. The lid didn't quite settle into its groove at first. A hammer tapped it once, then again. The wood held. The man wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped back, satisfied enough to move on. The crate was marked complete. Inside, a phone finally rang, and was answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end spoke quickly, assuming familiarity, assuming context. The man holding the receiver nodded as if the speaker could see him. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we have it." He did not clarify what it was. When he hung up, he wrote a brief note on a scrap of paper and tucked it under a stack instead of placing it on top. He told himself he would bring it up at the next check-in. There would be time. A door opened. Another officer entered, removing his gloves as he walked, speaking before he fully crossed the threshold. "They're ready on their end," he said, "whenever we are." The phrase settled into the room without resistance. "Good," someone replied. "Then we're aligned." Aligned. The word carried a sense of order that was comforting, almost reassuring. It suggested that whatever had been drifting would now move in parallel. At the map table, the man who had been tracing lines all day finally stepped back. He folded the map once, then twice, creases meeting creases as they always had. He didn't notice that the pencil mark near the junction now fell directly along a fold, partially hidden. "Let's proceed," he said quietly. There was no announcement. No formal acknowledgement, just a subtle shift in posture, a collective acceptance that the day had reached its next phase. Chairs were pushed back, papers were gathered, movements became more purposeful, less tentative. A runner was dispatched with a message that contained no urgency in its wording. He jogged rather than ran. He would arrive on time. In the radio room, a switch was flipped. A channel was cleared. A confirmation tone sounded, brief and clean. Someone initialed a logbook and moved to the next line. The clock continued to tick, indifferent to the meaning that had just attached itself to the moment. Outside, the wind finally reached the ground. It moved through the yard in a low sweep, lifting dust, rattling loose debris, nudging a door that hadn't been latched properly. The door swung inward a few inches and stayed there, open enough to change the air inside the building. No one went to close it. Inside, conversations shortened. Instructions became simpler, stripped of qualifiers. People stopped double-checking, not because they were careless, but because the process no longer allowed for it. The sequence had begun to carry itself. The woman with ink-stained fingers stamped the last document in her stack and set the stamp down. She looked at the pile, then at the empty space beside it, waiting for the next set of papers that did not come. For the first time all day, she had nothing to do. That unsettled her more than the busiest hour. A final message arrived and was acknowledged with a single word: received. Nothing followed it. Somewhere in the building, a mechanism engaged, a lever pulled, a valve turned, a signal sent that did not announce itself with noise or spectacle. It was the kind of action that looked like maintenance to anyone watching from a distance, but it changed the conditions. From that moment on, any attempt to stop what was unfolding would require more than hesitation. It would require interruption. It would require explanation. It would require admitting that the normal day had crossed into something else without permission. No one said that out loud. The room did not fall silent. It did not tense dramatically. It simply continued, carried forward by procedures already in motion, by messages already sent, by assumptions now embedded too deeply to extract. The invisible line had been crossed, not with a shout, not with an order, but with a quiet, irreversible acceptance that the waiting was over, and whatever came next would arrive whether anyone was ready or not. The building seemed to exhale all at once, not in relief, in resignation. The radio went quiet between transmissions, the silence no longer awkward but complete, settled, as if it had decided to stay. When the voice returned, it did so briefly, efficiently, and then vanished again. No one commented on the gaps anymore. They had become part of the rhythm, like the ticking clock or the distant hum of systems that no longer required supervision. Someone noticed the open door at the end of the corridor and finally walked over to close it. The hinges creaked softly, a complaint that felt too loud in the stillness. The latch clicked. The sound echoed longer than expected, as though the building were hollow. A man checked his watch and then did not look at it again. Outside, the yard had emptied. The truck that had idled for so long was gone now, leaving behind a faint oil stain on the ground that no one would notice until much later. Dust settled slowly, reluctantly, disturbed only by the wind that had grown steady, but not strong. It carried scraps of paper along the fence line, nudging them forward inch by inch. Inside, chairs were occupied again, but no one sat comfortably. Hands rested on knees, on desktops, on the edges of tables. Fingers interlaced, unclasped, then interlaced again. Breathing became something people were aware of. Each inhale measured, each exhale released as quietly as possible. The map lay unfolded once more, but no one touched it. Its lines and markings existed now as a record rather than a guide. The pencil mark near the junction was barely visible beneath the fold, easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. A final check was performed, not because it was expected to reveal anything new, but because the checklist demanded it. Each item was acknowledged. Each box was marked. The last one took a moment longer than the rest. "Done," someone said. The word landed flat, final without sounding important. The woman with ink-stained fingers stood and stretched her back slowly, carefully, as if afraid that sudden movement might draw attention. She gathered her things, aligning them neatly, then stopped with her hands resting on the desk. For a moment she seemed about to say something. Her mouth opened slightly. She closed it. In the corner, the clock ticked toward a minute no one had named. The sound felt closer now, sharper, each second pressing forward with quiet insistence. No one tried to stop it. No one adjusted it. Time had been allowed to run too long to interfere now. A distant sound drifted in from beyond the walls. Low, sustained, impossible to place. It could have been machinery. It could have been weather. It could have been nothing at all. The sound held, then faded, leaving behind a sense of expectation that had nowhere to go. The radio crackled. A hand hovered near it, then pulled back. Waiting had become the only remaining action. The room stilled in subtle ways. Conversations ended mid-thought and were not resumed. Eyes fixed on empty spaces. Shoulders squared, as if bracing for a shift in gravity. The air felt tight, compressed, like the moment before pressure equalizes. Everything that could be done had been done. Everything that could have been said had found a reason to remain unsaid. The normal day had reached its quiet edge, and somewhere just beyond the reach of sound, beyond the margin of delay, the next moment was already arriving, unannounced, unavoidable, while everyone inside the room held their breath, suspended in the last second before time finally moved on.